It's July 26th, 2026. Welcome to the video, everybody. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from. Because right now, just a few hundred feet from one of the most sensitive nuclear sites left standing in Iran, American aircraft did something that regional air defense crews are still trying to process. A strike package went in overnight, hit a security checkpoint and a set of access tunnels sitting close enough to the mountain complex known as Pickaxe Mountain that Iranian state media scrambled to control the narrative within the hour. For weeks, the American president has been threatening to hit this exact site. Now, it looks like the opening moves of that threat are already happening, close enough that you could throw a rock from the crater and hit the tunnel entrance itself. And if that's what a warning shot looks like, you have to ask what the real strike is going to look like when it comes. So let's get into it, because this is the story that actually matters right now, more than almost anything else happening in the world. Before we get to what happened last night, you need the full picture of why this mountain has become the single most dangerous piece of real estate on the planet. Back in June of 2025, American B-2 stealth bombers flew a mission that will be studied by military historians for decades. They dropped massive ordnance penetrators, bunker-busting bombs weighing around 30,000 pounds each, designed specifically to punch through layers of reinforced rock before detonating. The targets were three facilities that had haunted non-proliferation experts for 20 years: Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. At the time, officials called it a total success. Natanz was described as wiped out. Fordo and Isfahan were said to have taken catastrophic damage. Mission accomplished, in other words. Except it wasn't quite that simple, and this is where things get interesting. A leaked assessment from inside the U.S. intelligence community suggested the sites were seriously damaged, sure, but not fully destroyed, and that Iran's actual timeline to rebuild had only been pushed back by a matter of months, not years, like officials were claiming publicly. Israeli intelligence reportedly landed on a similar conclusion behind closed doors. And here's the part that should worry you more than the buildings themselves. Even if every single facility above ground had been leveled, Iran still had its stockpile of enriched uranium. Some of that material was sitting at levels close to weapons grade. Nobody outside Tehran's inner circle knew exactly where every gram of it ended up after the smoke cleared. Turns out, Iran had already built itself an insurance policy long before those bombs ever fell, and it's called Pickaxe Mountain. In Farsi, it's known as Ku-e-Kolangaz-La, sitting about 2 kilometers south of Natanz, in the exact same mountain range. But this facility was never designed like Natanz or Fordo. Those were built to survive an attack. Pickaxe Mountain was built to make an attack functionally pointless. Satellite analysts have been tracking this site for years, watching tunnel entrances get carved into the rock from 3 separate directions, east, west, and south, forming a complex that sits, by some estimates, over 300 feet below solid stone. That's deep enough that even the massive ordnance penetrator, the same bomb that took down Natanz, might not fully finish the job in a single pass. For a long time, this project crept along quietly. Then June 2025 happened, and satellite imagery analysts noticed something that should have set off alarm bells across every intelligence agency watching the region. The moment Natanz got hit, construction at Pickaxe Mountain suddenly went into overdrive. Security walls went up around the entire perimeter within weeks. New excavation began almost immediately. Researchers who track Iran's nuclear infrastructure for a living said the pattern was unmistakable. If the shallow sites were going to keep eating airstrikes, the future of the program needed to move somewhere the bombs physically couldn't reach. And then came the detail that turned this from a construction story into a full-blown 5-alarm crisis. According to reporting tied to Israeli intelligence assessments, Iran moved actual centrifuges, the machines that spin uranium into weapons-usable material, into Pickaxe Mountain last fall. Centrifuges aren't something you casually relocate. Moving them means you're either protecting old equipment or you're actively setting up shop somewhere new. When the American president was asked directly whether Iran had moved centrifuges into the mountain, he gave an answer that was more careful than people expected. He said something to the effect that it doesn't mean much unless Iran also has the material, meaning the actual uranium, sitting there with it. And as of the most recent assessments, that uranium stockpile is still believed to be located at the original bombed sites, not inside the mountain. So take a breath here, because even in the scariest version of this story, moving machines into a tunnel without the fuel to run them isn't the same as an active weapons program humming along right now. It's a future capability being quietly assembled, piece by piece in the dark. Now here's why last night matters so much. This new round of fighting didn't start out of nowhere. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched what was described from day one as major combat operations. Not a limited strike package like the 12-day war in 2025, but a full campaign targeting military assets, missile production, and government infrastructure across the entire country. The stated goal was blunt: keep Iran from ever building a nuclear weapon and dismantle its missile program completely. That immediately raised an uncomfortable question in Washington. If the 2025 strikes had truly obliterated the nuclear program, like officials claimed at the time, why did a much bigger war become necessary again less than a year later? Some lawmakers pushed back hard on exactly that point. Others defended the new campaign, arguing Iran had spent the months since the ceasefire quietly rebuilding both its enrichment capacity and its missile stockpile, proving the earlier job had never actually been finished. And the missile numbers back that argument up. Even before this new round of fighting kicked off, some assessments put Iran's monthly missile production in the dozens. Other officials estimated it at well over 100 missiles a month. However you slice it, Iran never actually stopped rebuilding, and its total inventory, believed to sit in the thousands of ballistic missiles, remained one of the largest in the entire region, even after getting hammered in 2025. There was actually a moment where this looked like it might wind down peacefully. In June, both sides signed an interim memorandum of understanding, pausing the heaviest fighting, reopening the Strait of Hormuz to shipping, and setting up a 60-day window to negotiate something permanent, including terms addressing the nuclear question long term. For a few weeks, it genuinely looked like an off-ramp existed. But the agreement left one massive question completely unresolved. Who actually controls traffic through the Strait of Hormuz going forward? And that single gap in the deal is exactly where everything fell apart. Iran started threatening, then attacking, commercial vessels transiting the strait, seemingly trying to force international shipping onto routes Tehran controlled, possibly to collect fees or exert leverage over one of the most critical waterways on the planet. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that stretch of water, so any disruption there sends shockwaves through global energy markets within hours. When 3 ships got hit in early July, the ceasefire effectively died. The United States responded with retaliatory strikes framed around protecting commercial shipping, and unlike earlier phases of this war, these strikes didn't stop after one round. Central Command posted updates almost every single night for close to 2 weeks straight, describing fresh waves of attacks on Iranian military targets. The human cost has been brutal on both sides. Multiple American service members have been killed since fighting resumed in July, some in attacks on bases in Jordan, others in northern Iraq, with dignified transfers held at Dover Air Force Base drawing national attention every single time it happens. Nearly 100 additional troops have suffered injuries, mostly described as minor, since the renewed fighting began. On the Iranian side, authorities have cited figures suggesting at least 50 people killed and more than 500 wounded just in this most recent phase, with Iran's own cumulative claims for the entire war, going back to February, running into the thousands, including a disturbing number of children. Those Iranian figures haven't been independently verified, but nobody credible is disputing that this war has already produced a devastating toll on regular people who had zero say in any decision being made above their heads. And this war has stopped being just a two-country fight. Houthi rebels in Yemen, aligned with Iran, launched their own strikes recently against oil infrastructure inside Saudi Arabia, hitting facilities in Jizan and Yanbu with a mix of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. Saudi Arabia hit back directly at Houthi positions, opening an entirely new front layered on top of the existing war. Air defense systems have activated across Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan at multiple points as missiles and drones crossed into their airspace. Jordan has confirmed shooting down Iranian projectiles outright. Lebanon has become another pressure point, with some analysts describing it as sitting directly at the fulcrum of the entire confrontation. Even as the Israeli military quietly began handing control of a few southern villages back to the Lebanese military, a small sign of local de-escalation happening in one corner, even while things intensify everywhere else. Meanwhile, in a move that honestly deserves way more attention than it's gotten, Washington signed a 30-year civil nuclear cooperation deal with Saudi Arabia in the middle of all this. Reporting on the agreement describes it as including a so-called black box uranium enrichment facility built on Saudi soil, operated by American companies. For decades, U.S. non-proliferation policy has generally opposed letting new countries in the region develop their own enrichment capability, because enrichment technology sits right at the edge of what you need to build a bomb. Signing a deal like this while fighting a war explicitly about preventing exactly that kind of proliferation in Iran is the kind of contradiction that should make you raise an eyebrow, regardless of which side of this conflict you're rooting for. The United Nations, for what it's worth, has been about as blunt as diplomatic language ever gets. The Secretary General told the Security Council the situation is teetering on the edge of the unimaginable, which is not a phrase senior UN officials throw around casually. Saudi Arabia has formally asked the Council to condemn the Houthi tanker attacks and hold what it calls their Iranian sponsors accountable, trying to draw a direct line from the war in Iran straight to the instability spreading across the entire Gulf. Okay, now let's get back to what happened last night, because this is really the center of gravity for everything going on right now. For months, the American president has repeatedly threatened to strike Pickaxe Mountain directly, sometimes almost casually to reporters in the Oval Office, other times with an edge that made it clear this wasn't just talk. At one point, he told reporters the U.S. would be hitting that area pretty soon, and very heavily. In another comment aimed straight at Tehran, he said American forces were going to take out Pickaxe Mountain and that Iran should be ready. Those aren't vague hypotheticals. They've been specific, repeated, and escalating for weeks. And now, striking a checkpoint and access tunnel a few hundred feet from the site itself is about as loud a signal as you can send without actually cratering the mountain. Here's the thing that makes this target so uniquely brutal from a military engineering standpoint, and it's exactly what makes it so appealing to Iran as a hiding spot in the first place. Even the most powerful conventional bunker-busting weapon in the American arsenal has physical limits on how much rock and reinforced concrete it can punch through before it loses enough force to actually destroy what's sitting underneath. Some assessments suggest that a single pass, even with the same 30,000-pound penetrator that took down Natanz, might not be enough to fully disable everything running that deep. That's led to a genuinely serious debate among defense analysts about whether airstrikes alone can finish this job, or whether some kind of follow-up operation, possibly even a ground component to physically access and disable what's left, becomes necessary if the first strike doesn't do it. That would represent a completely different level of risk than anything we've seen in this war so far. At the same time, there's a much simpler angle here that doesn't require cracking open a mountain at all. A facility this size needs ventilation systems to keep air circulating. It needs power lines running in from somewhere. It needs cooling systems for sensitive equipment. And it needs some way for personnel and supplies to physically move in and out. Every one of those support systems is a pressure point. You don't need to crack the mountain if you can choke off what keeps it running. That's probably exactly what we saw play out last night. A strike aimed at the access route and security infrastructure rather than the deepest part of the complex, testing defenses, sending a message, and setting the stage for whatever comes next. Let's talk hardware for a second, because I think this is where people get lost in the headlines without understanding what's actually flying overhead. The aircraft capable of carrying a weapon large enough to threaten a site buried this deep are extremely limited. Realistically, you're talking about the B-2 Spirit, and its successor, the B-21 Raider, is reportedly entering the picture as well. Stealth bombers built specifically to slip past air defense networks and deliver exactly this kind of ordnance. These aren't fighter jets doing quick strike runs. These are long-range, deep penetration platforms that fly from bases thousands of miles away, refuel in midair multiple times, and drop a weapon engineered for one job, getting through rock that nothing else can touch. Pairing that kind of asset with real-time satellite imagery analysis, the kind independent researchers have been publishing for over a year, now tracking every new tunnel entrance at this site, gives you a picture of exactly how methodical this campaign against Pickaxe Mountain has become. This isn't improvised. This has been planned, mapped, and rehearsed for a long time. And it's not just the bombers doing the work either. Strikes like the one last night almost certainly involved a whole support package working in the background that never makes the headlines. You're talking about aerial refueling tankers, keeping those long-range platforms fueled up over hours of flight time. Electronic warfare aircraft jamming Iranian radar and air defense communications so the strike package can slip through with minimal resistance. And reconnaissance assets, both satellites and drones, feeding real-time imagery back to commanders so they know exactly what they're looking at on the ground before a single weapon ever leaves the bay. None of that gets a dramatic headline, but it's the actual backbone of how you pull off a precision strike within a few hundred feet of one of the most heavily defended sites in the entire country without losing an aircraft in the process. And whoever planned this last night clearly wanted to prove they could get that close without Iran being able to stop them, which is its own kind of message, arguably louder than the bomb itself. There's also a psychological dimension to a strike this close that people tend to overlook. Hitting the checkpoint and access tunnels rather than the core of the mountain isn't just about degrading infrastructure. It's about forcing every single engineer, technician, and security officer working inside that facility to sit there wondering if the next wave lands 20 feet closer. That kind of pressure changes behavior. People make mistakes when they're rattled. Equipment gets moved in a hurry, sometimes carelessly. Decisions that would normally take weeks of careful planning get rushed. If the goal here is to disrupt whatever timeline Iran has for actually getting Pickaxe Mountain operational, you don't necessarily need to destroy the mountain to do that. You just need everyone inside it to start making worse decisions under pressure, and last night's strike accomplishes exactly that, regardless of what happens next. Now, could Iran actually strike back in a way that changes the equation here? That's the question everyone in the region is asking right now. Iranian officials have leaned hard into rhetoric threatening escalation against American positions and allied countries across the Gulf. But the honest picture, when you strip away the rhetoric, is that Iran's ability to project power beyond missiles and drones is extremely limited right now. Its navy has been degraded. Its air force was never competitive to begin with against modern American and Israeli aircraft. What Iran actually has is asymmetric options. Proxies like the Houthis opening new fronts, missile and drone barrages aimed at bases and shipping, and the ability to make life miserable for anyone operating in the Strait of Hormuz. That's a real threat. Don't get me wrong. It's already killed American service members and wounded dozens more. But it's fundamentally a different kind of threat than the ability to seriously contest an American strike package built around stealth bombers and precision-guided penetrators. While all of this has been unfolding, Iran has continued cracking down hard on dissent inside its own borders. Human rights monitors have documented a pattern of executions tied to protests and unrest that predate this current war, continuing even as the country absorbs nightly airstrikes. Think about that for a second. A government simultaneously fighting off one of the most sustained bombing campaigns it has ever faced, while still devoting resources to executing its own citizens to keep control of the streets at home. That tells you almost everything you need to know about how this regime actually views its own population versus how it views its own survival. This isn't a government negotiating from a position of strength. This is a government that is scared on two fronts at once and reacting the only way it knows how, with force, both outward and inward. Let's shift gears for a second and talk about what's happening elsewhere in the world, because there's some real news worth flagging outside the Iran story. A worldwide caution alert went out from the State Department just days ago, warning American citizens to exercise heightened vigilance given how unpredictable the security situation in the Middle East has become, with airspace closures and flight disruptions expected to continue as this war grinds on. Airlines have already postponed resuming normal schedules through the region, and safety monitoring groups have flagged Iranian airspace along with large portions of Syrian and Lebanese airspace as high-risk zones that most international operators are actively avoiding right now. If you're planning travel anywhere near that part of the world, that's worth paying very close attention to. Separately, and on a much lighter note, there was an incident this week involving a pair of Royal Air Force Typhoon jets scrambled near Manchester in the UK. An unrelated story, but a reminder that military readiness postures are elevated well beyond just the Middle East right now, with Allied air forces staying sharp given how unpredictable the broader security picture has become globally. And over at the Farnborough International Air Show, which just wrapped up, there was a notable partnership announced between two aerospace firms working on bringing AI-assisted autonomy to commercial cargo aircraft. A genuinely fascinating development if you care about where unmanned and semi-autonomous flight technology is heading next. And a small reminder that even while the world is fixated on bombs falling in the Middle East, the next generation of aviation technology keeps moving forward in the background. It's a strange contrast when you sit with it for a second. In one part of the world, engineers are demonstrating autonomous cargo aircraft on a trade show floor, talking about efficiency gains and future logistics networks. In another part of the world, those same underlying technologies, autonomy, precision guidance, real-time data fusion, are being weaponized in the most literal sense possible, guiding stealth bombers to within a few hundred feet of a mountain that might be hiding the next generation of a nuclear weapons program. Same technological tree, completely different branches. That's just the reality of where aerospace innovation sits right now, dual use in almost every direction you look. Back to the main story, because this is where the strategic analysis really matters. Here's the piece a lot of coverage is missing right now. Iran's stated goal throughout this entire war has been sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz and relief from crushing sanctions. But what the regime actually needs, more urgently than either of those things, is a way to look like it's winning at home while it's getting dismantled piece by piece at sea and in the air. That's exactly why the executions and the inflammatory state television rhetoric keep climbing at the same time its actual military capability keeps falling. When you're losing on the battlefield, you compensate by tightening the grip domestically. It's an old playbook and it rarely works forever. The bigger question hanging over everything is what happens if this strike near Pickaxe Mountain last night was just the opening move. If negotiations currently being floated through intermediaries actually produce something real, something that includes genuine international inspection access to confirm what is or isn't happening inside that mountain, this could be the closest thing to a real resolution this war has produced yet. But if talks stall, and given the pattern of this conflict so far, that's a real possibility, the next phase almost certainly involves a direct strike on the facility itself, not just the access routes and security perimeter around it. And once that happens, there's no clean way to predict how Iran responds, whether that's another wave of attacks on shipping, another attempt to pull in the Houthis in Saudi Arabia further, or something more direct aimed at American forces still stationed across the region. There's also a bigger lesson buried in this entire saga that goes beyond just Iran. If countries around the world watch this conflict play out and conclude the real lesson is build your nuclear infrastructure deeper and harder to reach rather than negotiate honestly, that's an alarming precedent for the future of nuclear proliferation everywhere, not just in the Middle East. It suggests future standoffs increasingly become engineering contests. How deep can you dig versus how big a bomb can be built to reach you, rather than diplomatic solutions? That's part of why non-proliferation researchers have been obsessively tracking Pickaxe Mountain for over a year now, long before most casual observers had ever heard its name. This isn't just about one country, it's a preview of how future nuclear crises might get fought. So here's where things actually stand as of right now. The strike near the mountain last night is being read across the region as the clearest signal yet that a direct hit on Pickaxe Mountain itself is coming. Whether that's days away or weeks away, nobody can say for certain. Diplomatic channels through Oman are reportedly still active, trying to salvage some kind of framework around the Strait of Hormuz dispute that reignited this entire phase of fighting. But underneath that surface-level diplomacy, the military machinery on both sides remains very much active, with additional fighter squadrons and refueling aircraft continuing to flow into the region, even as talk of negotiation continues in the background. What's genuinely remarkable if you step back far enough is how this entire situation traces back to a decision Iran made years ago to hedge against exactly this scenario, building a facility specifically designed to survive the kind of strikes that took down Fordo and Natanz. It's proof that in modern conflicts involving nuclear infrastructure, the real story is almost never one dramatic strike. It's years of quiet engineering decisions, backup plans stacked on backup plans, and intelligence agencies on multiple continents piecing together fragments of satellite imagery trying to figure out exactly what's happening under a mountain none of us will ever actually see with our own eyes. It's also worth remembering the deeper history behind all of this, because none of it exists in a vacuum. Tensions between the U.S. and Iran stretch back to the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and the hostage crisis that followed, an event that set the tone for a relationship built on mutual suspicion that has never really gone away. A decade or so ago, there was an actual nuclear agreement between world powers and Iran that placed strict limits on enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. It offered a real off-ramp from this exact cycle. That agreement collapsed, and every attempt to rebuild something similar since then has failed to stick, which is a huge part of why we're right back here, staring at a mountain in central Iran and wondering whether the next move is a diplomatic breakthrough or the biggest airstrike of this entire war. And it's worth pointing out just how many times this exact cycle has repeated itself over the years. A deal gets negotiated, sanctions get eased, tensions cool off for a while, and then something breaks the trust on one side or the other, usually tied to enrichment levels or inspection access, and the whole thing collapses right back into confrontation. Each time that cycle resets, both sides seem to walk away having learned the wrong lesson. Iran learns that burying its program deeper buys it leverage and survivability. Washington learns that airstrikes buy time, but never really finish the underlying problem. Neither lesson actually gets you closer to a permanent solution, and that's exactly the trap this entire region has been stuck in for the better part of 2 decades now. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about actually understanding what's happening here, rather than just catching fragments through headlines, and that already puts you ahead of most people following this story. If this breakdown helped connect the dots for you, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of analysis reach more people who need the real context, instead of 30-second clips stripped of everything that actually matters. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the next update on this story could come at literally any hour, given how fast things are moving right now. Drop a comment telling me whether you think the strike near Pickaxe Mountain last night was a warning shot meant to force Iran back to the table, or the opening move of something much bigger that's already been decided behind closed doors. And if you know someone who's been trying to make sense of everything happening with Iran but keeps getting lost in the noise, share this with them, because a lot of the coverage out there jumps straight to the latest explosion, without ever explaining why one single mountain has become the fulcrum of an entire war. Looking ahead, there are really only a handful of ways this specific situation can unfold from here. Negotiations could genuinely succeed, producing a verifiable agreement that gives international inspectors real access to confirm what is or isn't happening inside that mountain, which would be about as close to a clean resolution as this war could possibly produce. Talks could stall entirely, leading to the full strike on Pickaxe Mountain that's already been threatened repeatedly. An operation that could range from a single massive bombing run to something far more prolonged if the first strike doesn't fully finish the job. Or we could see exactly what happened last night repeat itself over and over. Limited strikes on the supporting infrastructure around the site, rather than the core of the facility, slowly degrading its usefulness without triggering the kind of massive escalation a full assault on the mountain itself would guarantee. Whichever path this takes, the stakes go so far beyond just Iran and the United States at this point. A wider war risks pulling in Saudi Arabia, the Houthis, Israel, Lebanon, and whatever other regional players decide the moment calls for opening a new front of their own. Global oil markets remain hostage to whatever happens in the Strait of Hormuz. And the broader question of how the world handles deeply buried, deliberately hardened nuclear infrastructure going forward is a precedent military planners and policymakers everywhere will be studying for years, regardless of how this particular chapter ends. The story is genuinely still being written in real time, which is exactly why it matters to understand the full context instead of just reacting to whatever headline pops up on your phone next. The decisions being weighed right now over a single mountain, a handful of relocated centrifuges, and a stockpile of enriched uranium whose precise location remains uncertain even to the intelligence agencies tracking it, could shape the security landscape of an entire region for a generation. So keep watching how this develops, because whatever comes next at Pickaxe Mountain isn't going to be just another headline. It's going to be one of the defining moments of this entire war. However this plays out, one thing is already certain. The name Pickaxe Mountain, which barely registered outside a small circle of non-proliferation analysts a year ago, is now sitting at the center of one of the most consequential military decisions of this decade. And whether that mountain ends up as the site of a diplomatic breakthrough or the site of the largest airstrike this war has seen so far, the world is going to be watching very closely either way. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Like the video if it helped, subscribe for the next update, drop your take in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.